the Minister has just said is of interest, because he's suggested that he's half-minded not to amend Section 44 at all, which because he's overcome by the tedium of this debate, which is a very novel reason for abandoning a policy. But if I may say, it does occur to me that the mistake, the fundamental philosophical mistake that is being made here, I think, is this, and that is that the promotional appointments, if I may use that phrase, and I don't like it very much, I have to say, but the promotional appointments to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court are, in my view, matters on which the government itself should exercise its own discretion, because it is the government, as the executive, is the institution in whom that discretion is vested by the Constitution. And I do make the point, and I've made it before, but in this context it bears repetition, I think, and that is that the criteria on which the Commission, by reference to which the Commission are supposed to make their decisions for recommendation, which are set out in the Act, and which will be set out in greater detail in the statements of the Procedures Committee. The one thing that they're not allowed to consider is probably the one thing that the government will be most concerned with, and that is, you get in three names, and you say, who are these three people? What kind of Supreme Court are they likely if we take one of them, what kind of Supreme Court will we have if we accept one or more of them as recommended appointees? And what happens in this is, in fact, that government sort of comes to a view: is this person liberal or very conservative? That's one thing that the Commission can't take into account and is prohibited from taking into account. Looking at the judgment record of a particular judge, was he or she reactionary or progressive, if you want to use those terms, and I don't particularly like them too much, but these are the kind of things that the executive will ask itself. They will ask themselves the question, to take a very simple issue, which is of huge significance on the day-to-day lives of ordinary Irish people who pay insurance premiums. Is this judge somebody who takes a liberal and generous approach to the awarding of damages? And has he or she shown that as a judge of the High Court, say, or the Court of Appeal? And do we want to have that approach reflected in the jurisprudence of the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court? And there are other criteria, but those are the things, all of those things are the exact issues which the Commission isn't entitled to do. The Commission isn't entitled to say, Mr. Justice so-and-so, would you tell us why you consistently take such a generous approach or such a mean approach to the award of damages? Or would you tell us why you take a particular line on this or that? Those are the kind of things which the Commission can't ask of a candidate, and which the government is going to say, these are precisely the kind of things which would influence us as to whether somebody who's been vocally opposed to, say, various referenda being passed, whether we now want to put that person onto the Supreme Court. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for the government to look at the Supreme Court and say, we want to give it a more liberal complexion, or alternatively, we want to make it more conservative. They're going a bit off reservation or whatever. Those are perfectly reasonable criteria for the government to have in mind when they make an appointment. But the thing that I find really objectionable about this legislation is that a group of people who aren't entitled to consider that, who are expressly prohibited from considering that, make a selection of three names, and then the government is supposed to firstly consider those three people, when in fact different criteria govern government decisions to appoint people to the Supreme Court or to make them Chief Justice or whatever. So, I mean, that's what's objectionable about Section 44 being so confined. The Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court are hugely important courts. Their membership is a matter of huge importance. The same criteria on liberalism versus conservatism or activism versus whatever the opposite of activism is, I won't go idleness, but tedium. We use tedium as a phrase. But I mean, whichever, those are the criteria that the government will apply, and they are the criteria which the Judicial Appointments Commission is expressly prohibited from even going near. It cannot ask Ms. Justice so-and-so what her views are on social issues. It can't ask her that question. And it would be acting improperly if it said, she's a great liberal, we put her onto the list. That would be improper. You know, that's what's wrong with this whole idea of having promotional appointments dealt with in the way that this legislation is asking us to deal with them. And therefore, even if the Minister were to, in his exasperation, make no amendment to Section 44 and leave it as a matter for the Commission, I'm equally opposed to that. I am absolutely clear in my mind that the proper constitutional thing is to leave the government perfectly free to make promotional decisions among the judiciary to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court without the input of people whose varies and procedures expressly exclude them from considering the matters which the executive is bound to consider and does consider in making appointments. So I'm against the amendment on that account.
And that is that it seems to me that Senator McDowell is making a very valid point that it's important that the government should know the complexion of the mind of the judge that they're appointing, because this is an extension of policy. You know, the government is charged with making policy, and one of the ways in which they make policy is by appointing people who would support the kind of particular political complexion that the government wishes to see in the Supreme Court.
When we say political and policy, I take it you're not talking about party politics, you're talking about outlook and
oh yes, government policy.
Yeah.